Hey everyone, this is Danny, and today I have a guest, Robert, who recently put out a book called ADHD Pro.
Hello.
Okay, yeah, that's the way to usually say hello. I want to try out a more conversational episode with Robert here, who I've had really interesting chats with, and I figured people would find it interesting as well. If there's a lot of interest for it, we'll be doing more of it, hopefully, if Robert's interested. Really putting you on the spot here, Robert. But yeah, we don't have a name for it, but today we're going to be talking about our diagnosis and what people can expect after they get diagnosed for ADHD.
Yep. The common theme that I found when doing research for my book and just talking to people in general, and even with my own experience, was getting diagnosed. You think you have ADHD, so you go to a doctor, you go to a counselor, you go to a therapist or a psychiatrist, some professional, and you get diagnosed. Yeah, you probably have ADHD. Why don't we try out some medication? You get medication, and then that's it. There's nothing else. You're free to go. You have medication now. See you later. And there's so much more to that. And for some reason, nobody really talks about that. So I think that both me and Danny have a lot to say on this topic. So hopefully that anyone who just got diagnosed with ADHD or maybe hasn't done too much research can learn something today.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. Honestly, diagnosis is literally, it's step zero. It's not even step one, it is literally the prelude to your journey. A lot of the times people think that getting diagnosed is the solution, and a lot of the time taking medication is seen as answer, but no, that is literally the step before your first step. So Robert, why don't you tell your diagnosis story first?
Yeah, so I was in high school and in college. I'd always felt like I had trouble focusing. And I did the typical ADHD thing, which was to blame my work ethic or I'm lazy or, all these negative self-thoughts. And then finally one day I said, screw this. There's something wrong with me. So I went to a doctor, and my family doctor, and I said, send me to an ADHD specialist. I have no idea what that was. I don't even think he knew what that was. So I ended up at this, just another doctor who specialized in ADHD. And within 5 minutes, he said, yep, you definitely have it. Asked me a bunch of questions, saw that I was fidgeting, asked me, what I was having troubles with. And this doctor, very nice guy, had seen thousands of patients and pretty much diagnosed me on the spot. And he was very accurate. And he said, okay, well, the most effective solution to all your symptoms is medication, which from a medical standpoint, yep, all the meta-analysis, all the statistics, all the evidence suggests that the easiest, fastest way to alleviate the most symptoms for people with ADHD is medication, from a medical standpoint. So I got medication. It did help a lot. Danny, one of the things you said when we talked last time was you can feel the gears in your brain start turning the gears in your brain start kind of getting lubricated with this medication. And that's really what it felt like. And so by this time, once I got diagnosed, I was working in technology. I was my job was kind of part-time, half-time programming, half-time management and marketing and stuff like that. So I had a lot on my plate. I had many things I was doing, and I saw an immediate benefit, immediate boost to my ability to focus. The problem was the gears were turning, the focus was there, but there was no direction to this new power of focus that I had. I could not decide. I had a very difficult time deciding what to focus on, deciding what tasks I should do, deciding when something did not deserve focus, when I should stop focusing. So there was so much more for me to learn that was outside of the realm of this medical, prescription medication, whatever you want to call it, that no one ever told me. And so that now years and years later, I have those skills to some degree. But it was really bizarre to me that there was no one ever told me. I had to figure this out on my own. So I think you probably have a similar story, Danny.
I have a very similar story. If people don't get diagnosed when they're really young, and most of the people who get diagnosed really young tend to have the more hyperactive symptoms, I had more inattentive symptoms, so I got diagnosed after I started university. I started failing a lot. Initially, I thought it was just me, and then I thought, well, I don't think I'm this bad at studying, and I got a diagnosis, and then I started taking medication. Now, the interesting thing that you mentioned was, it's what I like to call a post diagnosis high, by which I mean a lot of people, when they get diagnosed with ADHD and they start their medication, things are amazing for the first couple of weeks.
Yep.
But eventually, everything starts kind of going out of control again because, like you said, there is no direction. A metaphor that I'm very, very fond of is that neurotypical people or people without ADHD have automatic cars with automatic gear shifting, and people with ADHD have manual gear shifting, and if the medication is like fuel that can actually help us start moving, things are still significantly more complicated for us. We see people driving and we're like, it's so easy. They just kind of like go, and like we have a lot more stuff in front of us, to actually control the gears. Does my metaphor make sense?
It totally makes sense. It's like,
okay, good.
It's like there's one problem in your way, which is this inability to sit still and focus. But it's not one problem. It's one symptom of very many diverse symptoms that are not the same for everyone.
Yeah. It's things. Medication is okay. So medication is. I often call medication. I often use the metaphor of glasses. They help you see better. But really, a more apt analogy would be someone who had never really seen anything before, who couldn't see from birth, and they got implants that allowed them to see. It isn't just you wake up and you can certainly do things just like everyone else. You still have to learn to see how to interact with things. Kind of like relate things that you've always touched or heard or smelled to eyesight, and kind of figure out how everything works.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And
okay, no, I'm just kind of making up metaphors on the fly, and I usually have time to kind of like sit down and really go over it. So it's
there's that thing where people who regain their vision, or go from almost no vision to much better vision, they start getting headaches for the first little bit because it's just too much for them to process
information. Yeah. And completely random, but quite relevant to the metaphor. There were studies that kind of like tested people who had no vision growing up, and when they got implants, they asked the people to kind of relate shapes that they'd felt before to what they'd seen. So they'd been given like a sphere, and they'd kind of be shown a ball and be like, do you know how this would feel? And they wouldn't be able to, because they had no way of relating touch to sight, because it was a completely new thing for them. Similarly, when you start taking medication, sure, you can finally do things, but you've just gone from a lifetime of not being able to drive to suddenly, kind of rushing full speed at 120 miles per hour, and you're like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to, change lanes or whatever. Definitely diagnosis and medication is literally the first step, if at all.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, but I had a lot of trouble regulating my energy after I got medication, and it wasn't because stimulant medication it's not like I was drinking too much coffee and I didn't know what to do anymore and I was like, twitching. It's just when I was able to focus, well, damn, I'm going to sit there and focus on the thing I want to do and not stop. And then I would get burned out every day because I would work till my eyes were closing, and and that I wasn't able to do that every day, but I just thought that I should do as much as possible every single day because now I can, and therefore I should. And that's not healthy at all.
It isn't, no. I know people aren't really a big fan of this, but I think the comparison of people with ADHD to children, when it's used kind of in an offensive manner is kind of shitty. But I think the comparisons are quite apt in many ways because kids, when they're growing up, they don't have good executive functions either. It develops over time. Yep. And our ADHD kind of gives us difficulties with our executive functions as well. And when you have young kids, you often find them kind of like playing and playing until they literally kind of like pass out, because they have, because they want to do things all the time and they don't really understand the concept of stopping or kind of pacing themselves. And honestly, we are quite the same. We've always gone from after taking medication, we go from a very chaotic brain to one that finally makes sense, but we don't know how to use it.
Exactly. And then I love that analogy too, because like children do this thing where they almost play too much, they get overtired, and then they get cranky and they start crying or having temper tantrums. And the only reason is because they're tired and they don't understand what tired means. And they don't understand why they feel bad. And they, it's like, I mean, I don't have temper tantrums, fortunately, but I have put myself into positions where I was so cranky and annoyed and frustrated despite having a quote unquote super productive day. And I could never understand what was going on with me. And I was like, oh, I'm like a little kid who's cranky. Like, and once you realize that, then you can start programming yourself around that or away from that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, like you, I do have temper tantrums, but again, the comparing ourselves to the kids is I find to be quite eye-opening, is because I tend to get quite mad when like it gets really warm or when I'm hungry, which I would say is not uncommon for ADHDers because we have difficulties kind of like figuring out how we feel. So as you said. You would start doing things and you wouldn't know why or when to stop because these are really things that people learn from a younger age. Pace themselves. All these things are executive functions, and it also has to be said that while our executive functions are affected by ADHD, we can still grow them. Executive functions can be learned and developed over our lifetimes. So just because someone with ADHD who started taking medication just can't do anything at all because they never learned anything doesn't necessarily mean they won't be able to do it going forward. But we hit the meat of the matter, which is oftentimes psychiatrists or doctors, it seems like the diagnosis and the medication is kind of the end all be all, but it's really the first step to actually start developing and learning and kind of figuring out your ADHD.
Yeah, exactly. And what did you do when you look back at sort of your own next step? How did you start that? And I guess like, how did you start figuring that out for yourself?
Now, this is a really funny story. So after I say it's a really funny story. It's actually incredibly sad. But after I got diagnosed and started taking medication, things were fine for a bit, but then things got really bad because even though I was taking medication, now it just made me feel worse because now I was struggling while taking medication. So it's like, oh shit, I got the help I was supposed to get, but I'm still struggling. Am I just a shitty person? Because, my car might be, moving faster than it did before, but I still don't know how to drive.
Still out of control.
and you know, unlike before when it was just like, oh, you know, it's my ADHD, now I'm taking the medication that was supposed to help me, but I'm still not able to control myself, which again made me feel worse.
Yeah.
So the things continued, and honestly things went worse and worse. But I was in a relationship at that time, and just my mental health, my ADHD, and just academic issues just caused the relationship. Honestly, you know, it was honestly mostly my fault. This is what I'm talking about, which I said was really sad. I'll try to move on quickly first.
You're laughing. So
But after it happened, sorry.
No, I'm just saying it's you're telling it in a very happy mood, so that's good.
Oh, I mean, I don't want to sound really sad. I did like a 10-minute podcast on relationships, and it was a really good podcast, but I sound like I'm near tears during the whole thing. So I don't want to do that for, you know, people listening in. So when that happened, it kind of like it kind of struck me out of the mindset that I was in, you know, the self-pity, inward focused mindset that we often get trapped in because we have like a lifetime of kind of trying to control our minds. I don't want to use the word selfish, but we tend to become very, you know, selfish-ish. You know, only thinking about ourselves, not because we don't care about other people, but just because our minds take up so much of our energy that we really can't, you know, we don't have enough energy to kind of deal with our external environment. And when the breakup happened, you know, and then it hit me that I was really affecting people around me with my behavior. You know, that it wasn't just about me. My behavior was affecting my loved ones, and I was kind of pushing them away. And that made me realize, you know, my actions have consequences. You know, and I realized I have to do something about it. Now, this is really funny because the thing with people with ADHD is we suck at things that involves internal motivation. But as you can see from my story, the biggest reason for my change was external motivation. The reason I changed was genuinely because I didn't want to hurt my loved ones anymore. And I did talk to quite a few people with ADHD, and I asked them the reason they started actually, you know, changing for the better. And a lot of them did say it was so they wouldn't hurt people around them. So, you know, I don't want to say I got lucky, but the external event where I realized that I'd hurt people close to me and that I'd hurt my significant other made me realize that I would need to actually start managing my mental health. Going forward.
Yeah, it's a kind of a similar story for me as well. For me, I was lucky enough that my partner is extremely like so patient that it almost doesn't seem real. But for me, it was a similar story at work where the external motivation, like I always felt bad about my inability to focus when it was me at school and it was kind of on my own. But as soon as it was my coworkers or my boss or, you know, clients or people that really relied on me completing something or delivering something or showing up properly or being focused on what they were trying to tell me, that I started really understanding that, hey, yeah, just because I have medication doesn't mean that I'm done the work, that there's so much more for me here to do. And this is beyond just me feeling kind of crappy about myself sometimes when I burn myself out, when I focus too much or don't focus on the right things. This is something that is still a work in progress. And it's so strange that we both came, and many people come to the same conclusion, but it's much later. It's like, well, I'm not done working yet. The result of my professional doctor or counselor or therapist or psychiatrist has kind of been like, yep, we're done. You've got your meds that make you feel better. It is very strange to me that is the case. And I think that some of the things that we were talking about before this, we started recording was around not really understanding where we want to get to with our ADHD. Like when I first got diagnosed, I just thought, oh, I want to solve it. And what does that really mean, right? Do I want to focus more? Well, like, okay, I'd focused more because I got medication, but I was far from solved.
No, that's a fantastic point. ADHD makes it difficult for us to realize how we're feeling, what we want, and all, everything else, which makes it very difficult to actually go forward, because to kind of grow and develop, we kind of need to know where we are and where we want to get to, like you said. So just that first step is actually quite difficult, just because of the difficulties with ADHD itself. And yeah, like when we get diagnosed, we're essentially told you have ADHD, and you're like, oh, I have ADHD, and we don't really know what that means for ourselves, and because we've been struggling for all our lives, we don't know what that means going forward. We don't know where we are, we don't know where we want to get, and people just kind of get lost, I guess. And I think that's incredibly common. Yeah, I mean, like even thinking about myself back in the day, it's like it makes me feel quite, like dizzy almost. It's just like, sure, I got diagnosed. I know I have ADHD and I'm taking medication, but now what? Like, what is life now that I have ADHD? Like, what is different? Where do I go? What do I do? It's scary thinking about it now.
Yeah. Again, it's so bizarre to me that this whole thing is so underappreciated too. Like, I mean, we can even get into experiences with therapy, and like I went to therapy for issues that I thought were unrelated to ADHD, where I was getting, it was almost like an anger management type of topic, where I would get really upset at certain topics and certain instances that I, in the moment, knew were so silly to get angry over. And it was only much later that I understood that this was not some deep-seated childhood trauma that was resurfacing, which, some people have. That's what made sense, that my therapist was digging in that area. But when I told, I always was very open with my therapist that, I have ADHD, I've been diagnosed. It's still a struggle for me. And yet every time I spoke about different issues, there was always this path that he was trying to lead me on towards something unrelated to my professionally medically diagnosed neurodevelopmental disorder, which was so weird to me. It's like, well, now I understand the reason I was getting so upset in the past, and still do sometimes, is because my brain craves stimulation and I'm not getting it sometimes. And in those times, the negative stimulation of being upset at something silly, or something that maybe isn't silly, but maybe doesn't warrant that level of anger, is just way more stimulating than everything else around me. And so I get stimulated by being angry. And that is what my brain... And now that I know this, it seems so straightforward. But there was such a hesitancy from, and I've spoken to other people about this too, where it's almost like an underappreciated or underemphasized root cause of many issues, right? Oh, you have ADHD, but you're probably mad because of other reasons. Like, well, why don't we look at the thing that I was diagnosed with first, and then we can dig into other things if that doesn't explain it. I don't know.
That's really interesting. Slight tangent, but the thing that chooses the negative emotions, that is the reason that a lot of people with ADHD become kind of like really, really drawn to drama, because, and I've definitely felt it as well, where you're thinking feeling sad or feeling bad is better than feeling nothing at all, So no, I definitely understand that feeling. But yeah, no, I think you mentioned a really good first step after diagnosis, which is kind of learn everything you can about ADHD, because, to kind of help yourself and help, if you're getting counseling or therapy, you kind of have to figure out how you're feeling and how ADHD might have potentially affected it. Because, like one of the big things about ADHD is that it affects emotions. But if whenever I ask people what is the one thing that, you were surprised was caused by your ADHD, people say it was emotions. I didn't know if ADHD affected emotions years later after my diagnosis because, it's just one of those things. It's like, I don't really want to call it an open secret, but that's kind of what it is, and no one told me, yes, but, part of it was also that I never really looked for it, like I could say, my psychiatrist never told me, or, other mental health professionals never told me, but I kind of never looked for it myself either. So really go out of your way, learn as much as you can about ADHD and kind of relate it back to your own behavior. And honestly, like you just said, for most people, it definitely turns out that ADHD was the cause of most of their problems because ADHD affects everything, so a lot of the times when someone with ADHD has an issue or is facing some difficulty, it turns out ADHD is the cause. Anything from like emotional stuff, memory, to even like like hypersensitivity, which is like a physical thing. So I have light sensitivity, which research has found is quite common in people with ADHD. Which you wouldn't think so because it's like a physical thing, but no, it is quite common in people with ADHD. Again, not saying that it is caused by ADHD, but it is a thing related to ADHD. So again, do as much research by yourself, go out of your way. The research I would recommend the most is Attitude, ADDITUDE. It's like a magazine online where people submit articles, and most of it is written by psychiatrists and mental health professionals. You can see at the very top, it says medically reviewed by blah, 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 blah. And if it says medically reviewed by, those are like the ones that you should really read. But go out of your way, learn as much as you can, and kind of try relating things that you read to your own experiences. Robert, anything to add?
Yeah, I was just thinking about when you get diagnosed, I think that professionals, whether they're a therapist or whoever they are, they should give you a checklist of, a thing that's like 100 checklist items long, where it says, do you have trouble with, do you get really angry at things that seem, silly? Do you have troubles with light sensitivity? Just like things that might be symptoms. And then you come back to them the next day and you say, out of these 100 things, 34 of them were applicable to me. And then you can start focusing in onto what actually problems you have, and then working one by one to alleviate those as much as possible, which is, unfortunately that type of checklist doesn't really exist. But like Danny said, you should absolutely 100% start researching ADHD as much as possible after you get diagnosed. A lot of people do it backwards. They'll say, well, I think I have ADHD. I'm going to Google this a million times. I'm going to see if this applies to me. I'm going to go on Twitter and talk to people and see if, they have similar symptoms. And that's really, really, really good. And then you can get diagnosed and you can get medication if you need it. But that work does not stop there. It should continue afterwards. So you can figure out what you need to do post-diagnosis, post-validation, post-medication, where you can then understand, okay, well, great, I now know that I have this brain thing and I can reduce the negative aspects of it if I pay attention to these very specific areas. But you're not going to be able to do that unless you learn what those areas are. It is really vital. If I could go back in time to when I was 18 and really starting to suffer from ADHD and really being going into these negative emotional spirals where I couldn't focus and I was upset, it wouldn't be showing up and telling myself to take medication, although that would have been very helpful. It would have been, okay, pay attention to all these symptoms and just be aware of them. And that in and of itself, I think, would have been so much, it would have caused me so much less pain over my life than than just getting diagnosed or just getting medication.
Yeah, yeah. Two things. We've been talking about diagnosis a lot. I do want to make clear though that a lot of people because of where they live or financial reasons aren't able to get a proper diagnosis. And even if you're self-diagnosis, that's absolutely fine. If nothing else, you should still read up on it and try to get as much help as possible from people's experiences. It's absolutely fine. A proper official diagnosis is good, but if you can't do it for whatever reason, that's fine as well. Self-diagnosis is absolutely valid. Robert, you were saying?
No, I agree with you on self-diagnosis. I've had a lot of people come to me and they're very worried or guilty or unsure that, they've looked online, they feel like they have ADHD, but they're not sure because they like you said, they're not in a position to go to a specialist. They don't, financial reasons, maybe your country isn't big on mental health. It could be anything. That, like, if you go and do a quiz that says, it could even be one of those silly online quizzes that says, do you have trouble paying attention? Do you have trouble, I don't know, do you have brain fog constantly, blah, blah, blah. Like, those are quite valid, even if they seem unprofessional or informal, because normal people do not suffer from these things so often. They just don't.
Yeah.
And if you think you have it, you probably have it. So this isn't to say that a informal diagnosis or self-diagnosis is just as valid as a professional diagnosis. It's just to say, if you do look up something like this and you think, okay, I'm pretty sure I have ADHD, but I'm not 100% sure, you can still go and try and go and look up your symptoms and try to deal with them, even if you don't have medication, even if you don't have a real professional diagnosis. You can still do so much for free with no medication, with no external validation of your ADHD, and still, get much better control over your symptoms.
Yeah.
Like there's no magical, validity that happens because a doctor says you have ADHD or it's just you. So yeah, so what you're saying, Danny, I totally agree with.
Yeah. The reason I wanted to clarify was I didn't used to be anti self-diagnosis, but I used to be quite hesitant about it until, it hit me that, a lot of people who want to get diagnosis just can't for a variety of reasons. I mean, I was quite lucky that, no, let me correct myself. I was going to say I'm quite lucky that my diagnosis was semi-free, but no, it actually wasn't. I had to pay for it. Because I was diagnosed in Ireland and I went to the private system, which cost quite a lot of money. A lot of people go to the public system, which takes a couple of years, if even. And this is a country where healthcare isn't completely free, but it is significantly more affordable than certain places where someone might not be able to get a diagnosis ever. So when that hit me, I realized that some people just can't get a diagnosis for reasons completely out of their control. So just because we're talking about a diagnosis doesn't necessarily mean if you can't get diagnosed officially, you're not valid. I just wanted to clarify that.
No, that's a good point too. The other thing I will say though, if you do self-diagnose yourself, please don't self-medicate yourself. That's the sphere where you definitely do need to talk to a doctor. There's a lot of stories too of people who work as journalists or something, or writers, and they take sort of Adderall without a prescription, or they fool their doctor into giving them a false ADHD diagnosis just so they can get access to stimulant medication. That's not a good path to go down, because the one thing I'll say about stimulant medication is if I take my medication, it calms me down. It doesn't make me go faster. It actually calms my brain down a lot. And if you're someone who doesn't have ADHD and you start taking stimulant medication, well, that I'm not a doctor, but just don't do that. It's probably not good for you.
The really funny thing, as you've been mentioning, I've read people with ADHD talk about when they take coffee, they actually get really sleepy and it helps them actually fall asleep, which is, quite the opposite to how most people, it helps most people like wake up and be more alert. Stimulants, it calms us down. Actually, it works quite differently to people without ADHD. So yeah, no, medication is quite dangerous. You shouldn't take medication, because honestly, it can cost you your life, because these are, quite, they can be quite dangerous if you don't take them perfectly as prescribed to you.
Yeah, totally. And especially if you have a heart condition or something like that. Anyway, I'm not a doctor, but
Yeah.
if you need any pharmaceuticals, please see a real doctor.
I mean, we're not doctors, but saying don't take prescription medication without a prescription, you don't need to be a doctor.
Probably a safe thing to say.
Yeah. So what were you talking about? What to expect going forward? Study as much as you can. You'd mentioned something else, but I've completely forgotten because we went off on a tangent.
Yeah, that's all right. I kind of wanted to actually jump into something with you that has been on my mind a lot, which is what are some of the strategies that you use that you would not have expected, or you were totally out of left field, that now you employ, that you kind of have to learn on your own, that maybe you're even you never would have learned them unless you really put them to use by yourself?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I think the biggest one, and this is kind of unorthodox, is to stop thinking of myself as like everybody. Like, yes, like don't compare myself to people around me, but like, I have ADHD, so I consider myself as someone with ADHD, and therefore like I think of myself differently to others. Does that make sense? Like,
Yep.
And the reason that helps is because it allows me to kind of put myself in kind of a mindset where, one, I don't compare myself to other people, and and kind of make myself feel bad because I'm not going at the same speed as others. It also allows me to like see how certain people are using certain strategies, and like I don't automatically try to use that strategy because I know that I have ADHD and my brain works differently, so it might not necessarily work for me. And things like, when people give me advice, I know that, they're giving that advice from someone, from a perspective of someone who doesn't have ADHD. And if I use it, not only might it not help me, it actually might hinder me.
Yes. So
yes.
glad you said that.
Yeah. Honestly, this is quite unorthodox, but it would really be to don't think of yourself. I don't know how to phrase it, but it's basically like you have ADHD. Your brain works differently to people without ADHD. So don't compare yourself or kind of like feel like you have to do things like everybody else.
I have a perfect analogy for this.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm very tall and I have very long legs, and this has caused me to have hip issues. When I started going to the gym and I wanted to do squats, I took the advice of people who did not have very long legs and who were not very tall. And they would tell me things like, oh, just put your feet like this, adjust your position like this. It'll make you feel better. And of course, I tried their advice for their bodies, for their leg lengths, for their hip structure. And for them, it was perfect advice. For me, it gave me horrible back pain. So it's not that their advice was bad or wrong or invalid or stupid or malicious in any way. It was great advice for them, and they were genuinely trying to help me, and they had genuinely good advice for them. But I just had a different body than them. I have a different bone structure, I have different hip structure, I have different muscular structure. I needed to do something else. And the only way I was able to figure that out was, I did look up different resources for the way I could do it. But ultimately, I had to learn how to do it properly my way. And I really like what you've said here is you kind of have to treat yourself as a brand new type of person or a brand new type of brain where, you can take advice from other people, but the advice you should get from other people should more be about where your destination is or where your goal is, right? If you want to you know, your goal should not be how to focus better for 18 hours in a row. Your goal should be, I would like to finish this large project that I really want to work on. And if someone says, well, just make a checklist, make a to-do list, do a little bit every day. Well, that advice is like the squat advice, right? That might work for your brain. It doesn't work for my brain. You know, my goal is something, and now I need to figure out the best way to sustainably work towards that goal. And unfortunately, the hard part is the only way you can do this is if you pay attention to yourself and build your own strategy and your own tools to get you there.
Did you figure out a way to do squats with your legs?
Yeah, I did. It turns out this is my frustration with therapists too, is I went to a bunch of physical therapists or physiotherapists and athletic therapists. It turns out I have extremely tight hips because I have a narrow hip capsule joint or whatever you call it, and there's just a bunch of exercises that I found online that work for me. And if I do those exercises and position my feet in a very specific way, then guess what? My back doesn't hurt anymore and I feel much better. But I would never have found that out had I not put in, you know, a lot of time into figuring out, yeah, I know my goal is to squat better without pain, but the work up to then was mine to discover. So it's kind of the same thing, I guess.
Yeah, no, like honestly, that was the perfect analogy. I didn't have one for it, and yeah, that was perfect. Just because you're getting help from other people, and just because someone else is able to use specific strategies, and you're not, doesn't necessarily mean you're broken or you're doing something wrong. It could honestly just be that you tick differently, and that is definitely when you have ADHD.
Your legs are just long. Like,
yeah, your legs are just longer. That's what having ADHD means. Having long legs.
Too bad. Like, figure it out.
Yeah, that's like if you read Robert's book, that was literally the first line in his book. Having like ADHD just means you have long legs. Now another thing connected to the don't think of yourself as everyone else, and kind of like consider yourself to be someone with ADHD, is your focus or goal shouldn't be to be someone who doesn't have ADHD.
Yeah,
I'm gonna be honest. This is gonna sound brutal. This is gonna sound like like super straightforward, or maybe even mean. But you can never get rid of your ADHD. You will always have your ADHD. You will never be someone without ADHD. Is that right? You will never be someone without ADHD. Yeah, that exactly. Yep. You will always have ADHD. So your goal should never be to get rid of your ADHD, because that's impossible. You will never get rid of your ADHD. Your goal should always be to learn to manage the negatives of your ADHD and to nurture and kind of bring out the positives. You can never get rid of your... Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I just love the way you've said that. I love the idea of nurturing the positives. I never put it as nicely as you did, so I just love it.
It's basically things that I've only found recently, because before I was very, ADHD sucks and everything about it sucks and there's no positives, and everyone who talks about the positives are just deluding themselves kind of way. But now that I've managed the negatives, I've managed to see the positives, and like everything else, ADHD just is. It's like you with your really long legs. The pros is that you're super tall, and super tall, the being tall is considered to be more attractive. The downside is you have health problems. I don't know if that's worth it.
No, there's an even more direct way to put that too. It's like, if at the gym, if you're into squatting, you might be doing also another exercise called deadlifts. And if you have long legs, you actually have way better leverage for that specific exercise. Now, the downside is your squats need to be adjusted and blah, 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 blah. But, there's pros and cons. And if I do all the stuff to manage my hip issues, well, those negatives are now reduced and the positives are still there. I don't have to get rid of the positives just to get rid of the negatives. And that's, going towards your point about you'll never be not ADHD. Well,
Mm.
why would you even want that? I'm not saying ADHD is only positive, but if you can nurture your positives and reduce the negatives, there's a chance that you'll actually be much better at a certain topic or a certain thing you like than someone who just is neurotypical and maybe doesn't have any of those pros.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that's,
no,
I think we both agree that the ADHD is a superpower meme is quite harmful in a
it's
lot of
awful.
ways.
I hate it so
But
much.
yeah.
Honestly, it is. I made a massive post about it on Twitter when I first started my ADHD Twitter, and I got into this massive feud with some like really, really like, like popular ADHD people from organizations and stuff, and I got like really mad, and it was one of my most popular posts, and that made me just quit ADHD because it was literally just me saying, no, ADHD isn't a gift. If
Yeah.
you think that, you're stupid. Okay, I didn't actually say that, but
Yeah.
that was my mindset back then. But no, the ADHD isn't a gift.
I feel like the superpower shit is from people who see, like, it's like if someone sees me at the gym and then sees, wow, your deadlift is so great. Well, by the way, it's not. But if someone said that, they are not seeing the like probably hundreds of hours of stretching and different exercises that I've had to do to make my hips not hurt. They're not, and it's like this external neurotypical viewpoint that, well, it's not always neurotypical, but it's almost insulting because you're not seeing the tremendous difficulty that we go through just to do simple things, or just to not get upset at some dumb, silly thing that we know is dumb and silly and we shouldn't get upset about it. Right? Like it is so frustrating to hear that. And I had a like Leonardo da Vinci, in my opinion, 100% had ADHD. And everyone thinks that Leonardo da Vinci was this, I mean, he was a super genius with amazing art skills and everything. But to me, when I read the biography about him, I saw a man that was always suffering. He was always felt so guilty and felt so bad about abandoning his big projects and abandoning these great works of art that he had been commissioned to do. And he has so many quotes about just how hard it is to finish things. And I just feel bad for that guy. And yeah, he was famous at the time and a lot of people loved him. And it's not that he had an awful life, but like, sure, you could say that's a superpower, but he also was full of negative emotions. I've had this thought once where, I wish I could go back in time, learn like old school Italian and talk to him and be like, listen, you have ADHD. It's a thing we're going to discover in the future. It's okay. Like, you're not alone. But anyway, one day when we have time machine.
Yeah. No, I totally understand. I totally get you as well. I mean, I never thought I would be in that position of defending that mindset, but I do have to like kind of balance things out by saying I kind of understand the people who say ADHD is a gift. Now, the people who I don't understand are like, the people who are trying to like push their like books and stuff. I mean, the books where they're like, I can teach you how to kind of use your ADHD as a gift. Those people make oil salesmen. But I'm talking about like who talk about how ADHD is a gift. I know what they're trying to do. They're trying to make it easier for people to kind of come to terms with their ADHD, because I myself used to like, hate my ADHD, and I used to feel so bad about myself because I had ADHD, and I, used to think to myself, I have ADHD. I'm never gonna be successful academically. I'm gonna have horrible, my relationships are gonna be awful as well, because statistically, ADHDers don't really go to university, and the ones that do drop out, and they have, they're much likely to get divorces and things like that, go to jail. So, I completely understand why someone would try to kind of push the mindset is, it's not supposed to be ADHD is a gift, and if you have it, you're a superhero, and, you're somehow like, better off than other people. It's supposed to be, ADHD is a gift. It's not all bad, like, you're not worse off for having it if you can learn to use it. I completely understand that.
Yeah.
My frustration comes from people who try to push the ADHD is a gift mindset as, all ADHD is a gift. If you have ADHD, it means you're gifted,
Yeah.
because that kind of implies that if you're not using your ADHD or if you're suffering from it, well, then you're kind of squandering it, and it's kind of your own fault that you're suffering. That's the reason.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to say that's that's not what you're trying to say. I just want to kind of like even things out, because one of the big people I saw pushing for the ADHD is a gift thing was charities focused on kids with ADHD.
Yeah.
And I completely understand that they would try to kind of push for a more positive mindset so the kids will have better self-esteem, and I completely understand that, right? And if someone wants to say that their ADHD is a gift, all the power to you. I just have a problem with people saying that all ADHD is a gift, because that implies my ADHD is a gift, and I can assure you my ADHD is not a gift.
Yeah.
Sorry, I went on a rant there.
I agree with everything you've said, and I'm glad you put that perspective out too, because yeah, and then there are it's funny you're talking about people who are trying to sell their like book that are snake oil salesmen. It's unfortunate that they do that, because there are a lot of people who they look at the negative parts of ADHD and they attribute that to this weird word called laziness, which is almost this meaningless word at this point. And it kind of, it puts you into the mindset of all the positives are not my fault because it's ADHD, but which is a gift, and all the negative parts are my fault because it's just me being lazy, which is the worst mindset ever. Like, why would you? It's such an dishonest, and I don't know. I don't know. I really find it a bizarre mindset to have. It's such a shallow and intellectually lazy position to hold. And anyway, I think if anyone's listening to this podcast who has seen this type of book or work or article before, you've probably already been able to identify that it's BS. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah. So where were we? So what we have going forward for people who just got diagnosed is to learn as much as they can about ADHD. Oh, and now that I'm remembering it, I would also highly recommend the YouTube channel How to ADHD. It's absolutely fantastic.
Yep.
And not to compare themselves to everyone around them, and not to try to get rid of their ADHD, because that is never possible. Does that sound about right?
That's correct. I agree with all those. And just in terms of finding...
I think it's the first...
Oh, sorry, you go on.
Go on. Oh, well, I was just going to say, I think that's a good first couple of steps after someone gets a diagnosis, in terms of where they should face.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to the research component there. You can, like, anything you do to understand ADHD better is all valid. There is no, non-valid resources. If you go to a Discord with people talking about ADHD, that's valid. If you go to YouTube and watch How to ADHD or some other channel, also valid. If you listen to podcasts, that's valid. If you read any book about ADHD, that's also valid. Like, even if you read something that you feel is incorrect, that is a good thing to learn, because you can then check off things that you do that, oh, yep, nope, this does not apply to me. Like, that's also a good step forward. Just because then you can narrow down what does apply to you and what doesn't, and you're always getting closer to understanding your brain by doing that.
That's perfect, actually, and that actually was the last thing which I was going to mention, which is essentially what you just said: never stop learning. Everyone has a different combination of symptoms. This is what me and Robert have been talking quite a lot about recently. Everyone has a different cocktail of symptoms. Even two people with ADHD, they might not have the same symptoms. And even if they do have the same symptoms, it might not, what's the word? It might not manifest itself in the same way.
Yeah.
So, some people are hyperactive physically, some people are hyperactive mentally. And the thing with all these things is, something that works for me might not work for you. So when you're doing research and, when you come across advice given for people by people with ADHD and you try to apply it to yourself and it doesn't work, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing something wrong. In fact, expect yourself to fail hundreds of times. Like the reason I started making my own ADHD content is because, well, first of all, I couldn't find much information out there. And two, it was because, I was constantly reading information and advice by people with different kinds of mental health disorders or, depression, anxiety, and kind of trying out different things and using it and kind of processing it. And I would find what works for me, I would simplify it, and I would give that as an output. Me putting it out there was really the end of a long chain of me trying multiple advice. So, oftentimes I would say, X worked for me, but, even though it worked for me, it might not work for you. It might not work for Robert. Even if we have the exact same symptoms, we don't live in the same country. We don't have the same background. We don't have the same family, friends, anything. So just because you can't seem to use advice or methods given by other people doesn't necessarily mean, that you're doing something wrong. And, leading to what Robert said, continue learning, continue reading, continue trying different things, because you will find a lot of things that doesn't work for you, but then you will also find things that do work for you.
Yep. I couldn't have said it better myself. And the last thing I'll say, just to add on to that, is if you do try something, it's a strategy, it's a technique, it's a method, it doesn't matter what it is, and it does not work for you, treat that like a positive thing. That's a good thing. You've just eliminated something that you can now consciously and enthusiastically and hopefully with a smile on your face say, yep, this thing does not work for me. I'm going to try something else. And then every time you do that, you get closer and closer to figuring out what does work for you. So really try to treat those like positives, because they are. You're getting closer to the real answer.
Yep. In fact, one of my biggest mottos in life, and this is 100% genuine, is literally everything is a learning experience. Yep. When I think to myself that anything is a learning experience, even when I fail, I feel better, because this isn't a worth time anymore. Now I know, as Robert said, that this doesn't work for me, so I can try something else. So again, everything is a learning experience. Just because you fail at doing something doesn't necessarily mean it was completely useless and a waste of time.
Yep, I again couldn't have said it any better myself. I think that if you do get diagnosed, try everything in your power to learn more and more and more. And that's really the whole summary of what we've talked about here. Is if you do get diagnosed, the now what part is you doing a hell of a lot of learning. And that is the most effective way to figuring out what works for you.
Yeah, no, that was a perfect summary of everything. And we're just about to hit the 1 hour mark, so we should probably wrap up.
That was great timing.
Yeah. Do you want to plug your book? I don't know how this is done.
Neither do I, to be
honest.
Plug
your snake oil book.
Yeah, so I did write a book. It's called ADHD Pro. It's about creating a sustainable strategy for being both productive and happy at the same time with ADHD. It does go over how to build a better strategy. It's not a brain hack or like trick book. It's more about how to go from sort of this place of being diagnosed to building a better strategy for yourself, and what are the different components you should practice. And yeah, if you'd like to check that out, it's at adhdpro.xyz. I apologize for having the weird domain name, but I liked the name, and that was the only domain name that fit. So there you go. Yeah, that's who I am. Or you can also find me on Twitter at just Rob Merki, Merki. So that's it.
Yeah, and we're close to 1 hour. And I hope you liked this episode. If you do, please leave feedback.
Just yell at Danny on
Robert,
Twitter.
we do want to do more. Sorry?
Just yell at Danny on Twitter if you have feedback. That's how it works.
Yeah. Like, I really do want to do these kind of conversational things with Robert because I feel like we had good conversations. So, yeah, hope to do more of these episodes, and thank you for listening.
Thanks a lot.